History remembers kings, warriors, empires, but there are some names history doesn't celebrate. It hides them, buried, distorted, almost erased, because some stories are too disturbing to repeat. And this is one of them. His name was Udre Udre, a ruler, a war leader, a figure of power. But that's not why people remember him. They remember him for something else, something that turns history into something far darker. Because every enemy he defeated didn't just die, they disappeared. Not buried, not burned, consumed. Let that sink in. This wasn't a one-time act. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't survival. This was something repeated, systematic, intentional. And the most disturbing part? It was counted. Stone by stone, body by body. Each stone representing a life taken. Each stone marking something that happened after death. And when those stones were counted, the number wasn't dozens, it wasn't hundreds, it was something far beyond that. A number so extreme, it doesn't feel real. And that's where the story changes. Because this isn't just about what he did, it's about why. Because no one reaches that level of brutality without a reason. And once you start asking why, everything becomes darker. Because in his world, this wasn't madness. It was power. A way to control fear. A way to dominate enemies even after they were gone. Because when people believe that defeat doesn't just mean death, but something far worse, they don't fight. They don't resist. They break. And once people break, you don't need to control them anymore. They control themselves. And that's what makes this story terrifying. Because this wasn't just physical domination. This was psychological control on a level most people can't even imagine. And here's the part that nobody talks about. This wasn't hidden. People knew. They saw it. They feared it. They talked about it. And still, it continued. Which raises a question that's hard to ignore. How does something like this go on without being stopped? Because it wasn't just one act. It became a system, a ritual, a symbol of power. And symbols like that don't just exist. They are built, maintained, protected. And once they reach that level, they become untouchable. Because fear protects them. And fear is the strongest defense of all. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Because the more you look into this story, the more you realize this wasn't just about one man. It was about a world where brutality defined leadership, where fear created order, and where power was measured by how far someone was willing to go. And he went further than anyone else. Further than what people could understand. Further than what people could even accept. And that's why his name survived. Not as a hero, not as a legend, but something else entirely. A warning. Because once you understand what he became, you realize something far more dangerous. This wasn't the limit. This was just what was recorded. And once that thought enters your mind, you start to question everything. Because if something this extreme could exist, openly, repeatedly, without being stopped, then what else has history buried? And that's where the real story begins. What you just heard, that question, that weight pressing in the back of your mind, that feeling you can't quite shake. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of understanding it. Because to understand what Udre Udre became, you have to understand the world that allowed him to become it. A world that didn't operate on written rules, didn't rely on structured systems, didn't depend on fairness. It depended on perception, on belief, on what people accepted as reality. Because in that world, power wasn't something you held, it was something others believed you held. And that belief was everything. Because once people believe something deeply enough, they don't question it, they don't challenge it, they don't test it, they accept it. And once something is accepted, it becomes real. Not because it is true, but because it shapes behavior. And behavior is what defines outcomes. That's why fear is different from strength, because strength requires proof. Strength requires demonstration. Strength requires constant reinforcement. But fear? Fear reinforces itself. Once it exists, it spreads, quietly, effortlessly, without resistance. And once it spreads far enough, it doesn't need to be proven anymore. It becomes assumed, expected, unquestioned. And that's the level he reached. Not just a man people feared, but an idea people believed. An idea that existed before he arrived, an idea that lingered after he left, an idea that shaped decisions long before any action was taken. Because when people expect something, they act accordingly. They prepare differently. They think differently. They hesitate. And hesitation is where power is lost. That's why most conflicts are decided before they begin, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. Because once doubt enters, action slows. And once action slows, control shifts. And that's exactly what he mastered. Not just control of territory, but control of expectation, control of perception, control of thought. Because once you control how people think, you don't need to control what they do. They control themselves. They limit themselves. They surrender without being forced. And that's what made his presence overwhelming. Not because of what he was doing in the moment, but because of what people believed he was capable of. Because belief creates anticipation, and anticipation creates fear, and fear creates obedience. And once obedience exists, power becomes effortless. That's the cycle. That's the system. And systems like that don't rely on constant action. They rely on maintenance, on repetition, on stories. Because stories are how fear survives. Not facts, not evidence, stories. Because stories travel, stories evolve, stories grow stronger every time they're told. And in a world without constant verification, stories become truth. Not because they are accurate, but because they are believed. And once something is believed by enough people, it becomes the foundation of reality. That's why his actions didn't need to be witnessed by everyone. They only needed to be told, repeated, expanded, until they became larger than life, until they became something people wouldn't question, only fear. And once fear reaches that level, it stops being emotional, it becomes structural. It becomes part of how people live, how they think, how they decide. And once that happens, it's no longer something you can remove easily, because it's no longer external, it's internal. It exists inside people, inside their choices, inside their reactions, inside their expectations. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because external power can be challenged, it can be fought, it can be removed. But internalized power, that's different. Because people defend it themselves without realizing it. They protect the system because they believe in it. And belief is stronger than force. That's why systems like this don't collapse quickly. They resist, they adapt, they hold on long before the original source of power begins to weaken. Because the system is no longer just the person, it's the people. And once that happens, the system becomes self-sustaining. But no system, no matter how strong, is perfect. Every system has limits, weak points, cracks. And those cracks are where change begins.
At first, they're invisible, too small to notice, too insignificant to matter. But over time, they grow, because pressure builds, always. And pressure doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And once it reaches a certain point, it has to go somewhere. And that's when things shift. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, almost unnoticed. Because change doesn't announce itself, it develops quietly, in thoughts, in doubts, in questions. Questions like, what if this isn't absolute? What if this can be challenged? What if this isn't as powerful as it seems? And those questions are dangerous, because questions lead to thinking, and thinking leads to resistance, and resistance is the beginning of collapse. Because once people start thinking, they stop reacting automatically. They stop accepting things without question. They start observing, analyzing, comparing. And when that happens, they begin to notice something that was always there, but hidden by fear. Limitations. Because no matter how powerful something appears, it always has limits. But fear hides those limits. It distorts perception. It exaggerates reality. It makes something finite feel infinite. And as long as that illusion exists, power remains unchallenged. But the moment that illusion breaks, everything changes. Because now people don't see the same thing. They see possibility. Possibility of resistance. Possibility of change. Possibility of control shifting. And once that possibility exists, fear begins to weaken. Because fear depends on certainty. Certainty of outcome. Certainty of control. But once uncertainty enters, fear loses stability. And once fear loses stability, it can't hold the system the same way. That's when the collapse begins. Not loudly, not immediately, but inevitably. Because systems built on fear don't adapt well to doubt. They depend on it not existing. And once it does, the system starts to break, piece by piece, layer by layer, until eventually what once felt unbreakable no longer holds. And when it happens, the collapse isn't controlled, it's chaotic. Because everything that was held together by fear falls apart at once. And when it falls, it reveals everything. The truth, the limits, the reality that was hidden by perception. And that revelation is the most powerful moment of all. Because once something is seen clearly, it can't be unseen. Once reality replaces illusion, it can't go back. And once people understand that, everything changes. But here's the part that stays. Because even after the collapse, even after the system disappears, even after the power fades, something remains. Memory. Not just of what happened, but of how it felt. And feeling lasts longer than facts. Facts fade, details shift, stories evolve, but emotions stay. And those emotions shape the future. They influence how people think, how they react, how they respond to power, how they recognize patterns. Because once something like this happens, it leaves an imprint, a psychological mark, one that doesn't disappear with time. And that's why this story matters, not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about power, about fear, about how easily things can go too far when no one stops to question them. Because questioning is the only thing that breaks the cycle. Without it, patterns repeat again and again and again. And here's the final realization. We look at this as something distant, something separate, something that belongs to the past. But that's the illusion. Because nothing starts at the extreme. It builds, step by step, choice by choice, moment by moment, until one day it no longer feels extreme. It feels normal. And normal is where the real danger begins. Because once something becomes normal, people stop seeing it for what it is. They stop reacting. They stop resisting. They stop thinking. And once thinking stops, control takes over. Completely, silently, effortlessly. And that's what makes this story truly dangerous. Because it's not just about what happened, it's about what can happen again if no one recognizes it, if no one questions it, if no one stops it. And once you understand that, you realize something unsettling. This isn't just history, it's a pattern, one that doesn't disappear, one that doesn't end, one that waits for the right conditions to begin again. And once it begins, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't reveal its limits. It simply grows until it becomes something no one can ignore. And by then, it's already too late. And that's the part that stays with you. Not what happened, but how easily it could happen again.